So I'm in the process of finishing a video up now. It's pretty much a presentation. Kind of debating on how I'm going about with the images, because there can be a lot of images with these presentations because I kind of cover a lot of topics. Excuse me, when I do kind of bring stuff forth. One of the main things I'm going to present in this 5-minute video here is about going within and accessing, people term as 0 point, but that's more of a kind of technical term related to energy generation and things like that. But it's basically reaching a neutral point, and how it could be explained and how it could be perceived and experienced in order to actually achieve results. And so a metaphor for this is that if you imagine you have a spinning wheel, and this is part of the video, but the video is about an hour. I just finished the audio for it. You have a spinning wheel, and in the conscious waking moments, we are on the outside of the wheel. And on the outside of the wheel, there is a dot. And each dot is a unit of time. And each unit of time could be, it's like the hands of the clock, or the lines basically denoting the time on the clock. And so it could be a day, a minute, a second, a moment, years, whatever they are, they're units, and they're interchangeable in the depth, maybe you zoom in or out, but they are continuous and separate consciously as defined by our perception. Meaning, as long as we're perceiving in the conscious manner that exists, at least initially on the outside of that wheel, which we have to, in order to perceive separate moments, they'll be separate and they don't stop. They're continuous. It's like a coil or a slinky or something that just continues. It's a wheel. And so in society, we interact in these ways of organizing ourselves according to the continuous binary that's not plugged in. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. I hope this isn't worse. I've been dropping this, and because I do my little excursions and windstorms and things like that, and it's been picking up some nasty noise lately. So out in society, it's all related to physical waking consciousness, and therefore kind of three-dimensional reality, which you have to have this linearity for there to be any sense of solidity, motion, order in the first place. You can't just have a jumble. And so, you can, but then it goes into what is called dream time, and that's not what we have here. You don't drive cars in dream time. If you do, you invent it, and it appears, and you're in it, and then when you get out of it, you don't use the door, you think yourself out of it. So which is kind of strange, because we're in this environment that it stabilizes around these parameters so that change does not happen very rapidly according to our consciousness. It takes time, and it builds up, and so therefore we have this type of simulated stability through which we can kind of develop long-term character roles and development, basically like that. And so in this way of doing things, there is a binary, continuous pattern that repeats itself over and over. It's seemingly binary. And the idea behind this is that the transition point between one moment and the next is so finite, basically. It's so small or imperceptible that the conscious mind cannot be aware of it. It can't be aware of it by definition, because by definition, the exact moment that you are aware of it, you are consciously aware of the transition of one moment to the next, then the moment has already gone. That's the whole point. And so the conscious mind is not capable of attaining that frequency, basically. And I go into this in much more depth and tie it into some technology and a lot of stuff I've learned from my experiences. And basically, it's basically our destiny to figure this out. Just like dreaming. When you dream, you are usually not aware of the exact moment of transitioning into the inner state. As well, what would that be like? What would the perception of losing perceptions of the physical environment, the physical senses, how would that be perceived? There is no perception of it. It's literally a kind of it's a kind of experience that has no real substance other than the lack of one and the introduction of another. And so, in the same sense, it happens without the conscious mind being aware of it. You cannot be conscious of it. It doesn't work that way. You can only be aware of the result of it, that now you were there and now you're here, and it just happens. And so that background, how it happens kind of behind our consciousness, below consciousness, in the subconscious or the unconscious, depending on how you look at it, it's like a background processing of events that we can't actually bring into the foreground unless there is a practice or a way of shifting perspective from one into the other. And I go into this in much depth, but basically taking the foreground, or what is the foreground, and switching that with the background. It becomes, reality becomes like a magic eye visual optic illusion at that point, because in that flux, that transition of what is a normal sense of depth, perception, and like the order, we get this other vision that's added in by the artist. And the idea is, when we do this in reality, we get another view of the self in reality, which is somehow magically added in by some kind of cosmic artist, or it's just stitched into the way reality and the environment works. And so back to the main idea I wanted to cover here. And so, being aware of the transition, it's the same as the observer and the experiencer, the one in the body experiencing and interacting, and the one who is observing what happens to the body. The two are the same, but they cannot be experienced at the same time consciously. It's impossible. It's like this, all the other metaphors. It doesn't. It wouldn't equate. So we can access that through higher awareness or self-awareness, really. But in doing so, we defocus from what we consider a waking consciousness, more like a formal consciousness. We don't have to go into a trance state. However, when we make a transition into these modes of perception or perspective, they're equated to dreaming, a trance state, a state of spiritual awareness or heightened awareness, or something like a near-death experience or death. And basically we move into the subconscious, and we gain a different access to a different perspective of reality, where the boundaries between the self, the environment, or the non-self, so the self and the non-self, become blurred. And the outline of our self, defined through that, it becomes a gradient, a probability gradient, kind of like a cloud emanating off of our being. And we kind of begin to, we don't lose ourselves, we gain. Alright, I ran out of memory. Let's see if I can hurry up and finish this. So we don't lose ourselves with the emanating, with our definition of who we are, identity becoming a probability matrix, if you will, emanating off of our being. We gain the world. In other words, enough with the metaphors, I said, as it cut off. But by merging with the extra possibilities, the extra dimensional consciousness of who we are, awareness at that point, we gain a larger self. So the exercise here is very simple. It's a very simple concept. And the idea is that if we're on the outside, the perimeter of that spinning disc, that wheel, and everything must be proximal to the actual change that is occurring, because over time, as time continues, as experience continues, moment by moment, the change we experience, it will continue, it will repeat, but the patterns that basically describe the mundane aspects of change are not what are actually being measured there. There is not the actual nature of the change. The actual nature is not waking up, the sun going, you drive your car to work, etc. Those are repetitive, mundane aspects of reality on the outside of the pattern. They'll continue, they can switch in and out for other variables. The actual change is the self, its perspective, and how we grow over time, and how our relationship to the world, and our identity changes. It's how our awareness, our self-awareness, increases or decreases. And in that way, instead of increasing or decreasing, the pyramidal metaphor comes later, it'll be in the video, but we can say it's proximal to within or without, or within or without. And so we increase self-awareness by moving in, and we decrease by going further out into that perimeter view where the variety of the variables, the interchangeability between the variables gets more and more various and less defined and less centralized around a singular pattern. And so the pattern of what is actually changing over and over but remains the same, that's our identity. That's the true self. That's our self-awareness, which is what accretes over time and progresses and leads somewhere. The minute stuff, the mundane aspects, the variety, the variables, they contribute to it, but they are not the focus of it. They don't actually contribute to who we are. And so the metaphor is going from the outside perimeter, and instead of, the idea is to get stillness. But you can't do it by stopping the wheel. You'd have to stop the sun and everything else, the whole world. You have to stop everything. That's not going to work. You also have to stop your body. That doesn't work either, technically. So the metaphor then, you can't stop the wheel. You can't stop the world. Can't stop really your biology at this point. You can slow it down though, and that changes, that bends the laws of physics, if you will, your breathing, things like that, and that's where this goes. The metaphor is that you don't look away from the wheel and you don't stop it. To change, to organize the change, to reduce the continual, ineffectual, basically programmed, repetitive, binary behavior, which is like it's autonomous. All these things are autonomous. We don't want to see what's autonomous because it's already happening anyway. We want to know what's true, what's going to be there when all that autonomous change goes away, because in 10 years, 5 years, the patterns are still there, the time slots, but there are new variables there. What remains throughout all of that, endlessly, that is the true identity, the true self that has no form, i.e. it is not your clothes, your appearance, your car, anything like that. It's something that is always present throughout these things to describe how you are, basically how you drive, how you carry yourself, how you organize yourself. And the idea that the metaphor, which ties into an exercise, I always drag things on, is, well, life kind of does too. What if it didn't? It was like, you're born and it's over and it's whatever. And so instead of stopping it, and again, you can go further out, and it gets more and more forgetful of the true identity. It gets more and more proximal and kind of distant, always circling who you are, but never looking directly at it. The idea, if you didn't get it by now, which is also the point of these, is to say, what do you do? Well, pause it now, and what am I going to say next? What is the meaning if you can go further out and it gets more and more various, the lines get more and more farther apart, and there's more and more interchangeable slots that lead to nowhere because they're autonomous and anything can fit there. Well, you go in. You can't stop the disc from turning, but you go in, okay? You get closer and closer and closer to that center, that central point. That's the idea. Again, you don't need to pause it, but what does that mean? What is the metaphor? How does the metaphor complete itself in relation to this? The idea is, when you're looking down on the proximity, the perimeter, as each dot, day, time, whatever moves, you can only see one at a time. You don't have the other information of the other events, of the other aspects of the perimeter, none of that. When you move in centrally, you get to the core of where the change is emanating from. And when you get to that center point, when you reach a point basically where your cone of focus is focused enough over the center, you get a percentage of the change that is emanating out to all the sides, that is on each side oppositely, and you literally are aware of both what is being present, if you will, in the moment, and what is also yet to come, and what has happened in the past. And it's not perceiving or thinking about it in that sense, it's actually expanding your viewpoint to attaining a kind of non-thinking, non-perceptual awareness of it, just a flat observational awareness of it. Because it's different from thinking about events, about, well, what am I going to do tomorrow? Who's, concepts, worries, variables, things like that. That's just all you're doing there is looking ahead to that perimeter. You can look all you want. You can look as far ahead as you want. You're never going to see what's behind you. until you look down and move into the center and expand out. And then you see the whole thing at once. That's the whole point. So then it kind of becomes the metaphor of if there are multiple layers, kind of like a clock or something, and the colors all convene or converge in the center, you see each color pass, but you can't really tell what pattern is coming next. And you can, over time you can get it, but imagine the pattern is autonomous. The point is this wheel is a few hundred years, worth of information. I kind of just say a few hundred because it could stretch perceptually. Some people live 1,000 years of the informational aspect. Some people live only 50 years or so. So you can't pick up the pattern enough to know what all the dots, all the colors are going to be for all time. Your mind knows, but because we're part of the wheel, we're merged with that wheel we're connected to that, but it's not a 5-color or 5 shape wheel. It's thousands and thousands, because that's a very complex environment we live in our systems adapted to that. And so the idea is then, if each color was going, or each shape or something, if you get, and the shapes is important here, because then if there are slices, like a pie, a color pie or something, a pie chart, if you get to the center, they're no longer shifting, but you can see all of them at once where they converge. You can see the star pattern in the center, and you don't have to extrapolate of what might come in the future and what might be, and there's no theorizing and thinking. That's the whole point. It's direct observation. That's the idea behind that. So now the exercise is literally closing your eyes and reducing the autonomous physical binary stimulus, which is explained in a binary aspect, but is actually trinary because it's past, present, future. And within the larger aspect is what is continuous, because a binary autonomous program continues enough variability to describe change in time. However, in order to describe change in time as well, and have another layer on top of that of change that never changes and is always present, that's the next layer up. And so in order to see that, if you will, to get to that, we have all these continuous kind of autonomous changes that are basically guaranteed to continue, but are interchangeable as far as the variables, and there is an underlying structural pattern of change which represents that pattern that doesn't change. That's the continuity, that's the accretion of knowledge and self-awareness. And so by moving within in the metaphor, we kind of attain a central view of all the proximal change. By closing our eyes, it's the most basic version, or shutting out the physical senses through deprivation, isolation chamber, something like that, or just lying down or something, or going into nature where we kind of interface with continual patterns of nature, biology, animals, wind in the trees, something like that, and that kind of lulls our conscious mind into a synchronization with a larger mind, if you will. Again, if another concept I touch on in this video is how basically the impulses that come from the environment to the body, through the body, into our perceptual systems, basically our brain and our sensory system, that develops our basically perception of the world, of reality, a virtual construct, they're intrinsically linked to the source of the stimuli, the energy, the vibration, the information in the environment, whatever it is. The whole idea is that we're sensing ourselves sensing that. So in essence, we're sensing that. But if we are what we sense as far as waking consciousness in the body, then we are the environment that we're immersed in. So by integrating into that in a variety of ways, we kind of change the influence, the perspective of the self, and that is where the boundaries of the self and the non-self, the moment to moment, become blurred. And that's the whole idea behind that. But the basic idea in embodying this, or to achieve this as an exercise, is to close the eyes and go within with the intention of finding stillness, and attempting, basically imagine you're the wheel, if you will, the disc, and you're trying to find the innermost central point of your being, whether you're kind of somewhere lower around the chest, or the exact location in your brain. And you can basically go from the chest to the where is kind of the belly button, and then lower to the dantian, what is called the dantian. And it's basically your center of balance for gravity. And those work, but then in developing a point in the innermost center part of your mind, your brain, basically between your eyes and back of your head, and as well tying that together to the innermost point in your gut, and then below to your dantian, and then your chest, you form a core of awareness, which is, you're basically recreating, you're not imitating, but you're literally redefining and representing the innermost point of a disc, or of the curve that would spin in the inside of a pyramid, to represent basically the mathematical proportions that are drawn to a point, basically. And that is I could say fractal, but fractal leads into a deceptive version of the fractal understanding, which continues endlessly, and that's just an imitation. That is the false sense of awakening, the false sense, the false awakening, false enlightenment, where you're just recreating the image of the center on the perimeter, and just continues and continues and continues. And so it's like something to kind of like watch out for. But the idea of that center, the idea of the flat bottom pyramid going to a point, or a spiral to a center, the idea is to recreate that perceptually, or more so through visualization within your perceptual sense, your mind, because you're not really within your brain. And so you're actually creating electromagnetic fields by doing that, and they're interacting in a way that you're kind of generating a mathematical precision, if you will, to create that pattern. And so the better you are at doing that, at visualizing the innermost center point, and then going more into balance and more into balance, so that if it were a wheel spinning, more and more and more of an equally proportioned central view is formed, the more you will gain a what is the word for this? The more you'll gain a simultaneity of each varying, countering, or opposing proximal awareness of what was originally a one or the other binary pattern, and the view goes from basically being narrowed on like a spotlight to the outside, like the hands of a clock, to the center of seeing all the times at once. And it's a metaphor, it's an exercise, and you don't turn into a doctor, that one like blue god guy from Manhattan, Dr. Manhattan. You don't turn into him physically, but mentally you gain a new perspective. And the experience, I go into this in the video, that ultimately the goal is to flip over your perspective, and you gain a counter, or it's inverted, but it's not what we think of as inverted. We gain a kind of reflexive view on time and consciousness, and basically our self kind of turns inside out. There's this pinnacle, tipping point, critical mass of focus, where we gain enough momentum in that spinning wheel as we're simultaneously, instead of going out, we're spinning on it, where the view widens, and now we have all the information at once. And so that's an event, and it happens just by going within. And all we do is, what I was saying, it's not imitating, but it's representing. All you do is create an idea, or allow, they all flow through you, so just allow it to flow. And as it goes and tries to draw you out with the weight of the spin, and the weight of the idea, the motion of the spin of time, and the weight of the idea of the perspective wanting to go to the outside and begin a chain of thoughts, you allow it to pull, but you remain. And in doing that, you're like stretching out fibrous kind of electromagnetic strings, which eventually spin so fast that it forms a solid disc, and there's no longer one angle of perspective around the clock or one dot at a time. It becomes a solid disc, and your perspective turns inside out, and you get a kind of awakening experience through that. So that's the idea. It's a bunch of metaphors, a bunch of kind of drawn out explanations, but it's as simple as going within and playing a game of knowing your physical sense is here in this perimeter type experience view, and sneaking away from it so that it can't, interact with you. To interact with you, as you go further and further in, it has to jump through time gradients, if you will, in order to engage you. And the more it tries to engage, the more you allow, and you have no intentions of basically involving or interacting with the ideas, their worries basically, that want to pull us out to the perimeter. And in doing that, everything stretches, and you hit this kind of perceptual limit. And once that goes so far that it's kind of like it spins and it kind of expands, there's a flipping inside out of a perspective, and we no longer view the self from the perspective of the inside. It's as if we're viewing from the outside, and we gain the embodiment of all the things that basically define us through contrast and support the previous, waking physical perspective by being on the outside of it as the non-self. And we in a way become the non-self, and the views flip-flop throughout our life of exercising and doing this exercise. And it kind of changes to the point where we could be both. And because we're really both. That's the whole point. We're the consciousness and the subconscious. We're not one or the other. We're literally both simultaneously. We're the observer watching us experience and interacting, and later we're going to observe and ponder on what we saw. The idea is to attain it in the moment, and by doing that, in a way, it's a perceptual trick, a perspective shift. We can attain it in the moment, but in the same sense, you're usually not interacting while you're doing that. You're not driving a car, down the street while you're going into samadhi or something like that. Although eventually you can continue to attain it during various basically undertakings in daily life, and it becomes basically like second nature, knowing who you are. And it's when these experiences that are most likely to drag your perspective out to that proximal zone, the perimeter, and have you engaged and interacting as if those changes and those variables identify who you are, and they're going to add up to something, when they're just some random idea that's flowing on from some person or some external influence, whatever it is, some worry, some conformity, some fear, or personality flaw or something like that. And whether you shake its hand and take him to go somewhere, or her to out to lunch, or whether you, as the idea, not talking about a person here, or whether you just ignore it and walk right by, makes no difference at all. Those ideas, those are the ones that when you're in that state over and over again, you'll notice them, because they will basically arise as if the universe challenges you in a way to draw you out of that. And the more it tries to draw you out, and the more you resist, then the more energetic spread you get, where you're not it's like you're imperceptible at that point, because what are you if you've overcome the desire and the contrast, if you will, of basically being drawn out of your awareness. So then there are the exercises that develop that through the introduction of these distractions, these proximity experiences of awakened consciousness, such as the fear experiences, basically desire and temptation, all these types of initiations basically, which are designed to introduce the threat to your sovereign consciousness or awareness, and not consciousness, awareness, in order so that you can overcome it. And everybody has it backwards, but that's because everybody lives in the outside proximal world that's right now, it's spinning faster and faster, and if they don't go to the center and spread and see everything, they're just going to get thrown off. And so that's the metaphor, that's the idea. I hope you enjoyed it. It took me 3 or 4 tries to delete, but thank you. There's another video coming. It's about an hour. I was thinking about finishing tonight. I'm too tired. Very, very tired. It talks about a lot more in depth. Kind of cracked my mind a little bit, but it's the same concepts and tied into a much more detailed manner, and technical biological instructions as far as basically a hint of it. What it's about is flipping that consciousness in and out in a sacred geometrical format to the point where the subconscious and the conscious interplay in a way that changes the perspective, just like the way that I described, but it changes everything about the way one perceives life and the self through time and consciousness, and it's more or less what people call the pathway to eternity. And so give it a day or two and you'll see it. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify a little bit more here. One way to view the observer-experiencer dynamic and introduce that stillness, the concept of stillness, and that enabling eventually a simultaneous presence or superimposition of the observer and the experiencer at once, is to view this angle, okay, it's just an angle with the observer-experiencer on either end projected out from the center. Only, by being in waking consciousness and eventually or ultimately, or excuse me, inevitably going into the experiencer style of interaction where we're basically drawn out of ourselves, out of focusing on how we could be perceived or some type of observational aspect, and directly interacting with others and the environment in a kind of, not an autonomous way, but a way where we're focused on the environment and we're immersed in that. And in that sense, we don't know that we're immersed. It's taken over, so to speak. Experience has taken over. And so then after that's done, then we can there's a moment where we slide to the center and there's stillness, and then we go to the observer aspect and we go into what is known as introspection. And we think about what had happened and we form opinions and basically self-awareness learning. We develop an image of the self and awareness of the self based upon what had happened. And we do this all the time in life. It's part of a learning cycle. So then, if we can attain the ability to withdraw our interaction with that, the environment and ourself and our conscious mind in a way that basically causes us to become involved and we forget about that observer aspect, if we can withdraw from that, we move into the stillness of that moment in between each thought, in between each moment, in between each event or activity, where we then not transpire, but we move into an observer aspect. There's a countering of the quality of experience. And so in that middle portion, the moment between thoughts, there's a lack of change, a stillness, there's basically no action, and there's a realization of unity or non-duality. There's no difference there. It hasn't been expressed yet, in other words. And when we do this normally, we pause and then we go into the observer aspect, and it's one or the other, and this is the binary, autonomous, continual turning of that wheel that makes time flow. So if we can withdraw from both, we are simultaneously observing and experiencing, yet in that state there's usually no interaction, there's no defining qualities. We're not, like I said, we're not driving down the street or talking to somebody or anything like that. It's a state of continual introspection while remaining present. And so then this concept, this shape, is basically the wheel. The idea is just kind of drawn up. And in this, we have the perimeter where we're focused on only one dot at a time on the perimeter, and that continues over and over. And yet when we move to the center, instead of running faster on that wheel and trying to cover all the dots or looking further ahead, knowing that we're never actually going to be able to bend space and time and see around to the other side, because that's not how light and perception works, if we move into the center, then we can see the source where each dot, if you will, is deriving its contrast, its perspective from, and we go to the source. And when that is maintained, the important part here, the clarity, is when that circle in the center is proportional, then it expands. If it's an oval, it's going to flip-flop out and turn into a big, broken, it's going to like open up and break and it's elongate. It'll turn into an orbital instead of a spherical expansion. Only when it's proportional do we reach that spherical expansion, and only when we maintain it or sustain it for long enough time do we gain enough momentum through the resistance and the overcoming of the energy pulling us out. You see, each dot is pulling us outward, okay, our perception, our desire to engage, And when we build that up enough, that's basically turns from kinetic potential into a potential energy into kinetic energy, where we actually have that expansion experience. And so that's kind of drawn out geometrically, visually, if you will. And then another idea is that this is basically not perception, because perception is through the brain and the sensory systems, and this is all about perspective and awareness. There is no real way of describing what's changing here. It's just angles of perspective, of awareness. It's not really physical here. Another idea is that you can also view this perimeter aspect as the toroidal aspect of its existence, but imagine there's the toroidal shape, and so imagine that our existence is within, we're not in a wheel, we're not in a sphere, we're actually in a toroid. It's the next dimensional layer up. And so while we're in the perimeter of that toroid, we spin over and over again, and it's like being on a sphere that spins in a circle, and we can continue and rotate and continue and run around the surface of it, and we have all dimensions of motion, but it continues forever. It never gets to the point. Only when we move into the center of the toroid, because on the perimeter there's that interchangeable motion over and over again, and the farther out we go, the more diffuse the change becomes, the more spread out those lines get, and the more varying those dots become, although the pattern is the same, it just repeats itself. But only when we get to that toroidal center, the center of the toroid, do we find the equilibrium. And the reason I'm bringing in the toroid metaphor, geometric or visual metaphor, and it's also physics and scientific and all that, is because only when you get to the center point of that toroid do you find the entrance or exit into the higher or lower layer. Only in the center. You can't go through the walls, you curve around. Imagine space is the toroid, and by going to the perimeter, you hit a spatial boundary where time and space curves, and the faster and farther you go, the more your energy curves back and brings you back in. It's like a cycle that we really don't have shapes or anything like that to describe that, or any actual object in physicality. Would be like a never-ending cube. And so the idea is it's like it's a video game or something where you go out, and because it's bent, but it's space itself, not the material of the object that's bent, but space, the path that matter can move through, the medium of space. Okay, energy is bent. You can never reach the end. It just cycles you back around. The farther you go, the faster you go, the more you curve back around and meet yourself again, and you go nowhere. Only when you contract into the center by finding that central point, which you couldn't veer across the center, like you're cutting across the courtyard and hit it, you'll get pulled over by the gravitational pull, if you will, the curve of the other one end or the other. It would be like kind of skiing down a slope and coming up the other end. To balance perfectly in the middle would be so difficult. You spiral around the center and basically inch or wedge your way in until you find that central point, and you're just rotating in the center. Once that happens, you can go up that central core, which is in black holes, or theorized. There's X-ray jettisons, or so we're told. Hint, hint on the we're told. And in that center core of the toroid, that's where energy moves to the next higher or lower layer. And so we enter a larger toroid by doing that, and all the change of the motion capable, the dimensional motion capable in the previous view of spinning around the perimeter is contained in the center, and then the center goes up to a larger toroid, if you will, a larger environment, a new environment that contains the same amount of variety while also containing the informational substance of the previous multiplied, basically an exponentially new environment. And so, as well, remember the proportion, because you couldn't spin in the center of the vortex and go up or down if you were not perfectly balanced in the center. If you had one arm out and one arm in, you're going to flip upside down, flip over, and get shot out the other side. And I mean, not up or down, but the side horizontal, and then you're going right around the center again, or the center of the perimeter again, and the whole journey back to the center starts all over again and never repeats. And that's a little bit on that. Thank you. And one thing I forgot, that's okay, it'll keep you guessing. The dots are desire. That's what they represent. In trying to attain the center, meaning providing effort and motion and activity and ultimately entering into interactive experience, that is moving to the perimeter, because that energy the consciousness is you're processing information that basically places one within the perimeter. It's kind of like building speed to move to the other end of the toroid to get to the center, where that space and time is bent and curved. It will only return you to where you began, and the whole process continues. And so we attain the center by allowing ourselves to be most proportionally present without trying. Basically, by going flat, if you will, rather than attempting a motion or an action to resolve the conscious chatter and that turning of the perceptual wheel as well. You allow yourself to be drawn inward, to be equally, proportionally returned to equilibrium. And so the desire is to attach to the ideas of the self, the ideas that come through the conscious mind, or the self-defined perspective. Any aspect of the waking existence that wants to convince us that that is the entirety of who we are. The objects, the items, the ideals, the qualities of certain types of behavior and situations, that those are actually representative of the true self, because they're not. And so then again, the last piece here is that in doing this, in reaching that center, you're calibrating. It's literally like calibrating maybe a bullseye or something. And so in that state of determining what will draw you out, what will fly, and what passes and what doesn't, basically how strong you are in your willpower to sustain that proportionality, which is essentially by not being drawn out, but by staying focused on that infinitesimally small or finite, to the point where it's non-existent, perspective of the non-self, which means that the boundaries between you and other aspects of you and the environment, basically, and other people, begin to disappear. And when you what you overcome calibrates you towards what you can experience and what you'll define yourself as, and what overcomes you and what you can't resist, and what attracts your perception and desire will calibrate other areas of your life and the rest of your experience through that. Every other portion of you from that center point, whatever happens there, expands out and influences every other point of view around. And we're constantly doing this. It's not just during this experience or exercise, although when you're doing an exercise like this, that's when it's maximally at effect. That's when you also can control, you can map out what you want to basically deprogram from behavior or perceptions and habits and identities, false senses of identity, and what is okay. And really, none of it is okay, because none of it is actual. It's all proximal. If you can express it from this perspective, it's proximal. It's part of this Maya illusion, if you will, of running around the wheel, where we're basically consistently destined to move into the center and into the larger world. Whatever is formed in the center, whatever is realized there, is what becomes you. That's the power within that. Okay, now thank you.